And I'm calling to order the Special Organizational Board of Education meeting for Indian Prairie School District 204 on Monday, May 1st, 2023. My first order is to administer the oath of office to all of the members, but especially to the new members. I'm going to move over here and move to the side.
Oh, jeez. We don't have to raise our right hand or anything, do we?
We're all gonna do it.
She doesn't have to
Just
because
technically
she's
I-
already sworn in.
You're gonna look into that.
So I'm going to ask the board members to please repeat after me, and there will be natural stops for me in this, so just follow along if you will. I, state your name, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of member of the Board of Education for Indian Prairie School District 204.
I, Lori Donahue, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of member of the Board of Education of Indian Prairie School District 204.
In accordance with the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the State of Illinois, and the laws of the State of Illinois to the best of my ability.
In accordance with the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the State of Illinois, and the laws of the State of Illinois
To the best of my ability.
I further swear or affirm that I shall respect taxpayer interests by serving as a faithful protector of the school district assets. I shall encourage and respect the free expression of opinion by my fellow board members and others who seek a hearing before the board while respecting the privacy of students and employees.
I further swear that I shall respect taxpayer interests by serving as a faithful protector of the school district's assets. I shall encourage and respect the free expression of opinions by my fellow board members and others who seek a hearing before the board while respecting the privacy of students and employees.
I shall recognize that a board member has no legal authority as an individual and that decisions can be made only by majority vote at a public board meeting.
I shall recognize that the board member has no legal authority as an individual and that decisions can be made only by a majority vote at a public board meeting.
I shall abide by majority decisions of the board while retaining the right to seek changes in such decisions through ethical and constructive channels.
I shall abide by the majority decisions of the board while retaining the right to seek changes in such decisions through ethical and constructive channels.
As part of the Board of Education, I shall accept the responsibility for my role in the equitable and quality education of every student in the school district.
As part of the Board of Education, I accept the responsibility for my role in the equitable and quality education of every student in the district.
I shall foster with the board extensive participation of the community, formulate goals, define outcomes, and set the course for Indian Prairie.
I shall foster with the board extensive participation of the community, formulate goals, define outcomes, and set the course for Indian Prairie.
I shall assist in establishing a structure and an environment designed to ensure all students have the opportunity to attain their maximum potential through a sound organizational framework.
I shall assist in establishing a structure and an environmental designed to ensure all students have the opportunity to attain their maximum potential through a sound organizational framework.
I shall strive to ensure a continuous assessment of student achievement in all conditions affecting the education of our children in compliance with state law.
I shall strive to ensure a continuous assessment of student achievement in all conditions affecting the education of our children in accordance with the state law.
I shall serve as education's key advocate on behalf of students and our communities, schools for Indian Prairie.
I shall serve as educational key advocate on behalf of students in our community school and Indian Division of Indian Prairie,
and I shall strive to work together with the district superintendent to lead the school district toward fulfilling the vision the board has created, fostering excellence for every student in the area of academic skills, knowledge, citizenship, and personal development.
I shall work to work together with the district superintendent to lead the school district toward fulfilling the vision the board has created, fostering excellence for every student in areas of academic skills, knowledge, citizenship, and personal development.
Congratulations to all of you.
Congratulations, Kate.
I'd like to make my personal comment on the oath once again. This is the longest oath in the history of any office in Illinois. Every other sworn office in Illinois is just the first paragraph. But school board members need to spend 5 minutes giving oath. It's a little outrageous, but here
And
we
point
go.
of clarification, the last 2 paragraphs that we had to read were added since 2019.
Oh, so they've made it longer.
They made it longer since,
Perfect.
yeah.
Yes.
I think it's an opportunity for a resolution.
There we go. Michelle, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Carubus,
Here.
Mr. Rising,
Here.
Ms. Deming,
Present.
Ms. Donahue,
Here.
Ms. Jane,
Here.
and Ms. Gintz.
It is now time for public comment for agenda items. When addressing the, do we have any public comments? Then I will skip that one. Thank you. It is now time for nominations are in order for the office of president. Any nominations coming forward?
I nominate Lori Donahue as president of the Indian Prairie School Board 204.
We have Lori Donahue is nominated. Are there any other nominations for the office of president? 3 wait seconds. There we go. Hearing no further nominations, the nominations for the office of president are closed. I need a motion that the Board of Education vote the lone candidate for the position of president for the Board of Education.
To make a motion. I will make a motion that the Board of Education approve Lori Donahue as vice president of the Board of Education. As president. Wow, as president. My apologies. Let me try that again. Take 2. I make a motion that the Board of Education approve Lori Donahue as president of the Board of Education.
Is there a second?
I second.
Oh,
no.
together.
No.
Member Gins, please.
Ms. Gintz, okay.
I second.
Lori Donahue being the only candidate nominated for the office of president. Michelle, will you call the roll?
Mr. Rising,
Yes.
Ms. Gintz,
Yes.
Mr. Carubus,
Yes.
Ms. Jane,
Yes.
Ms. Deming,
Aye.
The vote is 5 to 0 in favor. By receiving a majority of the votes, Lori Donahue is elected president of the Board of Education. You now take the power from me. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I really am very humbled by being selected for this position again, so thank you very much. The nominations are now in order for the office of vice president.
I will make a nomination for Susan Deming for vice president.
Are there any other nominations for the office of vice president? Hearing no further nominations, the nominations for the office of vice president are closed. I now need a motion from the Board of Education, vote on the lone candidate for the position of vice president.
I move that the Board of Education approve Susan Deming as vice president to the Board of Education.
Second.
Susan Deming being the only candidate nominated for the office of vice president. Michelle, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Carubus,
Yes.
Mr. Rising,
Yes.
Ms. Gintz,
Yes.
Ms. Jane,
Yes.
Ms. Donahue.
Yes. The vote is 5 to 0 in favor of Ms. Deming. By receiving the majority of votes, Ms. Deming is elected Vice President of the Board of Education.
Thank you thank you for the honor invested by the board. I truly appreciate it and look forward to serving in this capacity.
I would like to also thank Mr. Rising for his service as vice president. You have been an outstanding support for myself, and again, there's numerous meetings that go on outside of this meeting, and you are always there and always full of ideas, so thank you so very much.
Thank you for entrusting me in the last 2 years for vice president. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, nominations are now in order for the office of secretary.
I would like to nominate Sapna Jane for secretary.
Sapna Jane is nominated. Are there any nominations, other nominations for the office of secretary? Hearing no further nominations, the nominations for the office of secretary are closed. I need a motion that the Board of Education vote on the lone candidate to the position of secretary.
I move that the Board of Education approve Sapna Jane as the Indian Prairie Secretary, Board of Education.
Second.
Sapna Jane being the only candidate nominated for the office of secretary. Michelle, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Deming,
Aye.
Mr. Karubas,
Yes.
Mr. Rising, Ms. Donahue,
Yes.
and Ms. Gintz.
Yes.
The vote is 5-0 in favor of Ms. Jane. By receiving a majority of the votes, Ms. Jane is elected to Secretary of the Board of Education.
Thank you for trusting me in this role. I promise to take good notes.
All right, one last, I now need an appointment of the Illinois Association of School Boards Governing Board Representative.
I will nominate Allison Fostick because she's not here and can't deny the nomination. No, she has expressed interest. I will nominate Allison Fostick in this capacity.
Allison Fosdick is nominated. Are there any other nominations for the appointment of the Illinois Association of School Board Governing Board of Representative? Hearing no further nominations, the nominations for the appointment of the Illinois Association of School Board Governing Board of Representatives are closed. I need a motion that the Board of Education vote the lone candidate to the position of the appointment of the Illinois Association of School Board Governing Board of Representative.
Make a motion that the Board of Education approve Allison Fostick as the IASB Governing Board Representative.
I second.
Ms. Fosdick being the only candidate nominated for the appointment of the Illinois Association of School Board Governing Board of Representatives. Michelle, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rising,
Yes.
Ms. Jane,
Yes.
Ms. Gintz,
Yes.
Mr. Karubas,
Yes.
Ms. Deming,
Aye.
and Ms. Donahue.
Aye. The vote is 5-0 in favor of Ms. Fosdick. By receiving a majority of votes, Ms. Fosdick is appointed to the Illinois Association of School Board Governing Board of Representatives for the Board of Education. All right, now we will have a presentation from Mr. Matt Shipley regarding District Goal 3 budget forecast.
All right, good evening, members of the Board of Education. As newly elected President Donahue mentioned, tonight was our second budget update as we work towards passing a budget for the 23-24 school year. This really is a continuation of the discussion we had at the February 27th Board of Education meeting, and so we'll be referring back to that discussion sort of throughout the presentation. Of budget presentations when we get to this time of year. The first is when things really haven't changed that much, and we've made some small changes that we'll cover tonight. The second type I did present a 5-year forecast that had balanced budgets for each of the 5 years included in that presentation. We did talk about how there are inflationary pressures that continue to impact all expense categories, and that does continue to through today, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail here shortly. One of the big challenges we talked about that's coming up about in a year and a half from now is the expiration of our ESSER funds. Those were the federal COVID relief dollars that we had were good for 3 years. Those will expire at the end of fiscal year 2024, and as a result, we are still working to make the impact to our programming and our IT as minimal as possible, but there is a possibility that we will see some reductions in programming once that grants funding runs out. We did talk about both a long-term challenge and a long-term opportunity when we look at our non-operating funds. So first, the long-term challenge relates to the capital project fund. That is the non-operating fund that really is responsible for funding a majority of the capital work we do throughout the district, so maintaining our buildings. We have some pretty good fund balance built up in that fund, but we're starting to spend that down, and that fund really has no recurring revenue sources. So we have about 2 or 3 more years where we can continue to invest in our building using that fund, and then that money will run out. The long-term opportunity we talked to relates to the second and non-operating fund, which is our bond and interest fund. We had issued significant bonds to build facilities throughout the 90s and 2000s. Those bonds are starting to come due, and our final payment on those bonds will be made in fiscal year 2027. So first, I just want to briefly show an updated revenue and expenditure statement for the current that we're currently in, that'll end on June 30th of 23. And I'm comparing this to the current budget. So as you can see, we are continuing to trend better than expected on both revenues and expenditures. This projected information has been updated through March. So we are 75% of the way through the school year, and believe we have a pretty good handle on where we're going to end the year. The projected numbers have been updated to include the wireless project. That was a significant technology upgrade that was presented at the last board meeting. We are hoping to fund that all through the current school year, and so we have updated our projected numbers for that. We did cover at the last meeting the purchase service variance, so that is the one expenditure area we're kind of over in, and that's a combination of additional food service, which is offset by revenue, so that's kind of a break even, but then also additional contractual services for some significant unfilled positions, unfilled needs throughout the district, where then we rely on contractual labor instead of hiring an employee who's an Indian Prairie employee. And then the final note I just wanted to mention, all funds and all accounts are within the legal requirements or legal range when compared to our operating budget. So we do not anticipate a need to present the board with a budget amendment or any changes to that budget document here for the remaining part of the school year. That is a state requirement that when you start projecting variances of more than 10%, you're supposed to pass an updated budget. This is just confirming we do not need to do that this year. So moving on to next school year, or the fiscal year 2024 budget. Shown here is what we presented to the board in February, along with updated numbers that are updated through today, really. 2 or 3 items I just want to point out. The first is that we have increased our property tax revenue slightly, just over $200,000, and that's a result of receiving the final extension from the county, which we receive in March every year. We're here on May 1st, which is appropriate. That is the day the tax bills are released as well. So our residents do have the data or the property tax bills that tie directly to that levy in hand. The budget now reflects the approved salary increases as well as approved renewals for food service, transportation, and custodial contracts that were all brought to the board at the April 10th meeting. We were pretty accurate with what we presented in February with where those contracts ended out. I will point out that the largest increase we saw across all those categories was transportation, where we're seeing a 14% route increase per route. With that said, only showing the 24 update this evening, I can confirm that this forecast continues to project balanced budgets for the remaining 5 years that we would have presented in February. Just want to cover in a little bit more detail the property tax increase. Again, the final extensions received from the county in March. I think it's a little when we passed the levy in December, as a board, it is a little misleading because we do not have final new property numbers, and we don't have the final EAV numbers for our residents or for our community. So we passed the levy really as an estimate, and then the county uses that levy and the estimate when the final numbers come in to issue what's known as an extension, and then ultimately issue the tax bills to all our property taxpayers. So with that said, our final new property amount came in at $54 million. This was compared to an estimate that was presented in December of approximately $50 million. That leads to that additional $200,000 of revenue mentioned earlier. And then secondly is that the tax rate is calculated by the county and becomes final with that extension as well. Our residents are paying a final tax of 5.33. That compares to an estimate of 5.31 we presented during the levy process in December. Just the graph here shows that tax rate over the last 10 years. And what I want to point out is we are sort of stabilizing around that 5.3 number over the last 3 or 4 years. That's really where our tax rate has come in. That really means that our property values throughout the district are increasing in line with the consumer price index. If you go back kind of to the 10 years or to the beginning of this chart, we were actually over 6 for a tax rate and have decreased that by 11% over the last 9 or 10 years. So there was a period, again, kind of from 2014 to 2017, 2018, where we were seeing property values increase faster than CPI. We've now seen that stabilize. What we don't want to see, and what would ultimately increase that tax rate, is if CPI outpaces the increase in property values throughout the district. Final 20 budget is just those non-operating funds. Again, no changes. It's presented in February, so showing our legal 23 budget, so what is adopted for this year, alongside our preliminary 24 budget at this time for both those funds. As mentioned earlier, there is a long-term opportunity here with the bond payments. That final payment is on December 30th of 2026, and the payments will decrease slightly each year from now until then. But again, that's offset by a potential long-term challenge, finding how we're going to fund our long-term facility needs once we kind of deplete the non-operating capital projects fund. All right. So with that, as mentioned, I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about evidence-based funding and the state of Illinois funding in general. Want to kind of start by going back in time a little bit to when evidence-based funding was really being debated, and that's the summer of 2017. I think one of the challenges that we'll see as we talk through this is there's sort of been what I'd call an elevator pitch or maybe a note card about evidence-based funding that kind of gets recited a lot by boards of education, by our advocacy groups, and even by state legislators. It's really a nice story. It's that there's some significant new money going into the evidence-based funding model. The money is targeting the underfunded districts or the most districts that are in most need of those funds, and that there's been a significant increase in the state investment. I think when you kind of really dig into the details, and this is a formula that requires thousands of data points to calculate each year, the story's a little more complicated. And so I don't want to hopefully go too far into the details tonight, but I at least want to give our board and our community some additional sort of talking points or things to thinking about as we talk about evidence-based funding at a broader level. So again, this really started as an initiative in that 2016-2017 period. If it helps you kind of go back in time a little bit, a gallon of gas cost $2.50. Spider-Man: Homecoming was the #1 movie at the box office, and perhaps the most remarkable, Mike Glennon was the starting quarterback for the Chicago Bears. So if that tells you maybe how far we've come in 6 little years, there's obviously been some significant changes since then. But known challenges in 2017, the state's fiscal condition was a significant challenge, almost a crisis during this time. The state had back payments of literally billions of dollars of bills. We used to talk during this budget presentation not about how far behind the state was in payments, sometimes up to a year on some of the grant payments. So even though the state wanted to make this commitment into a new funding model, there was this financial reality. Second in 2017, we were a divided state government. We had a Republican governor, a heavily Democratic legislative branch that was led by former Speaker Madigan. And so there was a lot of negotiation sort of between the Republican governor and the Democratic legislative body, let's go with that, during this time. The third challenge, just when we look at funding education on a statewide basis, is the city of Chicago and Chicago Public Schools. So in addition to being the largest district in the state with about 18 to 20% of the enrollment, it's also funded significantly differently than other state districts. The largest difference being that they manage their own pension fund. So all teachers throughout the state of Illinois, except CPS, pay into what's known as the Teachers Retirement Plan, or the Teachers Retirement System, which is managed by the state. CPS has their own pension plan. And so that, combined with some other intricacies or differences, creates a challenge when you're trying to put down one model that's going to apply to every district. Wanted to cover the 2017 challenges, but then we know that a lot has happened since then that I don't think anybody as part of this process would have thought about or put into the model. That obviously starts with the COVID-19 pandemic and the additional student needs that have come out of that. We talked already about some of the inflationary pressures that all districts are facing, including Indian Prairie. Again, this was a model that was formed in an era of 1% and 2% CPI increases, not 6, 7, 8% increases. Something that may have been a little predictable at the time, but really wasn't built into the model, was how to handle some statewide enrollment declines or significant fluctuations in enrollment. So we had about a 5% decrease, or over 100,000 students.
I think your microphone went out.
All right. Okay, I think we're good. It's green again. But we have seen about over 100,000 student decrease in statewide enrollment since the start of evidence-based funding. However, we've seen the expanded enrollment related to bilingual education, the recent increase of migrants throughout the state that have significant needs, not just from a bilingual standpoint, but across all education services. Has created some challenges, and really challenges in how that gets modeled in a formula that's maybe based on trailing data, and now we have a lot of movement coming in, maybe mid-year, students kind of coming and going from districts kind of in real time. And the final challenge I'll just mention that sort of ties to the 2017 challenge about Chicago. Chicago's now transitioning to an elected school board, and as part of that transition, what's sort of been uncovered a little bit is a lot of financial relationships and a lot of financial ties between the city and CPS. And so CPS is, over the next couple of years, is going to be faced with some challenges where they're going to be asked to fund things potentially that they haven't funded in the past, things that have traditionally been funded by the city. And I don't think it is a stretch to think that there's going to be some lobbying at Springfield to help kind of bridge that gap, especially because it was state legislation that ended up creating the elected school board for the city. Really quickly, just a summary of some of the major points or the mechanism with which evidence-based funding works. So again, this has been how the majority of state funding has been distributed starting in 2018. It is an attempt to address both inadequacy and inequity in funding. It replaced what was known as the general state aid model. This is done by calculating an adequacy percentage for every district, and that corresponds to a funding tier, Tier 1 through Tier 4. Indian Prairie, we're currently a Tier 2 district with an 84% funding adequacy. We've always been a Tier 2. We've ranged from about 80% to 84% through the length of time EBF's been in place. As part of the passing of evidence-based funding, the state committed to add $300 million annually to the formula. But that still has to be renewed annually as part of the budget process. So we're batting about 83% on that. The state has done that 5 out of 6 years. The one year they did not add the $300 million was for fiscal year 21, and that was kind of at the start of the COVID pandemic. There's what's known as a base funding minimum or a hold harmless feature, and this is that all districts receive at least the same money as they received the prior year. So again, districts with significant enrollment decreases or enrollment changes are at least guaranteed they're going to get what they got last year. And that's designed to provide some certainty to those districts and to avoid seeing districts that have some significant fluctuation in that state revenue each year. Approximately 90% of the new money has gone to Tier 1 districts. The cutoff for Tier 1 right now is 73% funding. One of the challenges, and again, when you talk about that elevator pitch of evidence-based funding, it talks about how Tier 1 and Tier 2 districts are getting a majority of the money. But when you look at it in practice, 90% has gone to Tier 1. So I would, again, if I was the one who got a chance to edit that pitch a little bit, I'd eliminate Tier 2 from that. I think as we look here shortly, you'll see Tier 2 performs actually very similarly to the Tier 3 and Tier 4 districts. So just some strengths of the model. It is equity-based. It recognizes the unique needs and funding capacities for each district. So each district is having an individual adequacy target calculated for it that says how much does this district need based on its specific student population. It builds on research that funds 27 elements necessary to provide public education. Those significant elements include core class sizes with the counts there showing a target of 20 students for K through 3, 25 students for 4 through 12 classes. It includes funding for additional specialists, instructional facilitators, interventionists, counselors, nurses, and librarians, really all the support staff that's needed. And then it even has additional funding mechanisms for those higher need populations, specifically for low-income students, English learners, and for special education. As mentioned earlier, substantially all the new funding has gone to the highest need districts with the highest need students. So now looking at sort of the numbers and how this has evolved over again the past 6 years. So looking at the top corner, that's the state budget in 2017, where $7.6 billion was budgeted for education, and $5.1 billion of that was the general state aid formula. As we transitioned to 2018, the state increased their investment in education about 10% to $8.3 billion. And you'll see that the general state aid went away and was replaced by two new pieces, the evidence-based funding formula and then a property tax relief grant. Again, we talked earlier about some of the negotiation between a Republican governor and a Democratic legislator. That property tax relief grant kind of became a key piece of getting this over the line. Mandated categoricals, this actually went down, and really what happened is about half the mandated categorical money rolled into EBF. So you'll see the increase of evidence-based funding from general state aid is about $1.5 billion. Some of that's new money, but a significant part of that is really the categoricals trying to be absorbed by that evidence-based funding amount. And that leads us to where we are today in 2023, where, again, the big buckets, so to speak, of funding have stayed relatively the same, and we're up to $10.1 billion of funding. Again, over 6 years, that's about $2.5 billion. It is a significant investment, about 33%. But I will point out that, again, we've had 2 years of pretty high inflation now, and so our cumulative CPI over that time is 23%. So while it is an increase, you know, a significant amount of that increase has just been absorbed by CPI. And again, the specific number added to evidence-based funding has been about a half of that 2.5 or 1.3 billion. So as mentioned, I just want to look at 5 sample districts and kind of look through a little bit their journey, if you will, through the evidence-based funding model. So obviously we're one of the districts, Indian Prairie 204, and 2 other districts we compare ourselves to regularly, Naperville 203 and Wheaton 200 are included here. But I've also included Chicago Public Schools and Rockford 205. These are both Tier 1 districts, and so I think it gives a pretty good insight into how Tier 1 districts have been impacted by this formula. So again, if you look at where we were in 2018 with the first year, we had adequacy percentages of 61% for Rockford, 63% for CPS, all the way up to 117% for Naperville 203. As we move into the 6th year, or 2023, there is some data that it is good news and looks like good news on its face, in that all districts increase their adequacy percentage. That ranges from 2% for Naperville 203 all the way up to 12% for CPS. CPS actually it saw their tier moved from tier 1 to tier 2. So they've been able to move out of that bucket where they're flagged as one of the highest need districts. They're now a tier 2 district. So that's again speaks to some progress. I will point out that the final column on that second slide, though, shows the increase in the adequacy target. So again, when we talk about inflation, when we talk about some of the evolving needs of our students, all districts, although we've seen an increase in funding, have also seen an increase in that underlying adequacy target. Again, to use Indian Prairie as an example, we've gone from an adequacy target of 11,854 all the way up to 13,775, an increase of just over $1,900 per student. So that's a recognition that even as maybe our enrollment has stayed level or decreased a little bit, we're still seeing an increase in the needs and the cost of services we provide each year. All right, so here's where we start, again, peeling back that story a little bit about that increase in adequacy percentage. And so presented here are those same 5 districts, and the green is the number you saw on the previous slide. So you see those increases in adequacy percentage ranging from 2 to 12%. The challenge is when you look at the formula and you start breaking out what's really driving that. Is it additional state funding that's driving that? Or is it additional local revenue driving that and the additional local capacity for the district that's driving that? So that's where you start seeing, again, this story start to have a little bit more nuance. So for Rockford has seen of an 8% increase in their adequacy percentage. 9% of that's really driven by that additional state revenue. But for everybody else, the majority of that increase is really being driven by local capacity. So we've been in an environment where, as we mentioned earlier, our property values have generally increased or stayed stable. The formula is assuming that the district is able to capture that as local revenue and is effectively adjusting that adequacy percentage, not because the state's provided additional money, but because the state says, okay, your local taxpayers are now capable of funding additional investments. Again, looking at these same 5 districts and looking at what the cumulative increase per student has been in evidence-based funding. So that's the first chart shown here. And again, this is where I mentioned earlier, you see Indian Prairie, a tier 2 district, really performing almost identical to a tier 3 district in Wheaton, and being significantly under the 2 districts that started as tier 1 districts. But I'd also point out even the significant difference between Rockford and CPS of over $1,000. So when you think, even though they were both flagged as tier 1 districts, there's some really diverse experiences when you talk about funding increases, even within within that tier 1. The second chart then, this is in the bottom corner. What we're trying to show here is that, okay, maybe as a goal we could have said, let's at least try to get all the new needs funded by the state. So maybe we could keep local where it is and have the state fund any of those new needs. So that change in adequacy target I pointed out a few minutes ago. What this shows is really for every district, the state funding hasn't been sufficient to cover that additional need. And again, you could see from Indian Prairie, one of our challenges is we've seen one of the highest increases in need. Again, almost a $2,000 increase that rivals Rockford and CPS, but have seen that with the least amount of state funding, or less state funding than Rockford and CPS. Similar state funding to the tier 3 and tier 4 districts. Final chart I just wanted to point out tonight, and this is all districts, and this was put out by this Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. This is a nonprofit group that's done a lot of research and done a lot of work on EBF. It breaks out the 4 tiers across the state and shows what again, what that funding gap or funding surplus is over the past 5 years, or 6 years, excuse me. And again, tier 3 and tier 4 districts, the formula acknowledges that they have a funding surplus. They are above the 90% target. And so what we can see here is that tier 1's gap has made progress. Tier 2 districts started this on average $4,100 per student with a gap. They've gone to $3,200 of a gap. Tier 3 and tier 4 have grown their surpluses. The tier 2 districts have actually seen a slight increase in that that funding gap. So again, when you talk about some diverse experiences with the evidence-based funding formula across districts, I would argue it's really the Tier 2 districts that have had the biggest challenge with the formula so far. So just kind of reiterating some of the takeaways I think I've already mentioned, but again, a lot of comparisons statewide kind of groups Tier 1 districts and Tier 2 districts together. I think the more relevant grouping is Tier 2 with Tier 3 and 4 districts. Again, a lot of the recent improvements we've seen in evidence-based funding is really a result of a strong environment for local funding and local property values. And that creates a potential risk or warning that if we did see a change in that environment, so if we saw a recession, if we saw property value reductions or other decreases in local funds, a lot of these gains would be quickly reversed. And again, as the formula is factored in now for significant funding to really trickle down, if you will, to Indian Prairie, it's going to take a significant lift from the state. So again, so with that being the Indian Prairie takeaways, this is trying to broaden it a little bit to maybe some of the or statewide challenges. So the first is that the goal was to hit that 90% adequacy target within 10 years. That $300 million annual commitment has never been enough to meet that goal. So there's always been that disconnect between the stated investment and the stated outcome or objective. And that's only continued to grow, again, with some of the inflationary challenges we've had and with the environment we're in. Again, we talked about this 90% adequacy, and I could see someone or a community member saying, well, why isn't the goal 100%? And the reason is that remaining 10% is assumed to come from other sources, federal revenues being another source, other local revenues, fees we charge, for example, being other source. But that's assuming a flat 10% across the state. And what we've seen is there's a wide range of federal funding available for districts. So statewide, there's an average of about 8%, which is closely aligned to that 10%. But when you look at some of those comparable districts we just looked at, the range really is 3 to 4% for Indian Prairie and Naperville 203, all the way up to 17 to 18% for CPS and Rockford. Just wanted to point out, when we talk about EBF, it does not include all expenditures, and I think that was a stated goal and in the model was to try and have it be as comprehensive as possible. But some of these areas were never captured and initially and haven't been built into the model since, and that includes transportation and food service needs. Capital and debt service is continued to presumably be 100% on local funds. Pre-K and transition programs are not included in this number. Significant special ed needs are not included in this. And then the final piece, again, just to mention and to tie back to one of that challenge with CPS, is that those pension payments that the state makes is not included in this model as well. And then the final challenge is none of these elements that are included in EBF and none of these formula assumptions tie directly to district-wide budgets or audits. Again, this I think was a stated goal in 2017 was to work that way, and here we are 6 years later, and we haven't made the adjustments necessary to some of those state budget forms. So when we talk about doing some of the comparison like we did now, that's really limited. It's limited to what's to the formula data. It's tough to reconcile the formula to annual budgets. It's difficult to compare across districts, across the state. So again, as we look to try and statewide assess how this has impacted student learning, how this has impacted student growth, how this has impacted investment, that's going to be a real challenge. So the final piece, just as mentioned, we do want to compare our Indian Prairie's EBF number to our actual budget. So again, this is something we can, my team in the business office can do for us, but can't necessarily do for other districts without their internal data. We can't do it based on publicly available information at this time. But with that said, Indian Prairie's evidence-based funding adequacy target was $360.2 million for 2023. When we look at everything we funded in our legal budget and assign it to one of the 27 elements, we find we funded $334.8 million of those needs. That calculates to about a 93% funding rate, and it represents about a $25.4 million shortage. Again, 93, how does that 93 compare to that 84? That's really that 10% difference we just talked about. We are using some federal funds to cover some of these needs. We do have those local funds. So in some ways, it's showing that at least for us, that 10% is lining up pretty closely with our actual results. And then again, the final piece, just talking about what's not included in here. We have over 100 million of total expenditures that are not related to EBF, and those are primarily funded by local property taxes. Even a higher percentage is being funded by local property taxes than items within EBF. Taking that sort of same analysis and applying it to our full-time equivalent positions, EBF would suggest that we would have just short of 2,900 employees working towards EBF components. Right now, we have approximately 2,650 of those employees. That's a shortage of about 214 employees and represents about 92.5% of the staffing we would need to implement all the elements. Again, just to reiterate, this staffing shortage is really a result of not having the funding that EBF documents it would be needed to meet the adequacy target. And then similar to the discussion about how much is not included in EBF, we have 400 Indian Prairie personnel that are providing legally required services that are not funded by EBF. So that is that preschool, transition programs, special education positions, and again, those are really being funded by property taxes. We also have about 100 central office positions, which are funded a little bit differently under EBF. So again, we have about 500 positions total that aren't hitting one of the EBF components directly. Just in looking through our data specifically and comparing it to the model, I think the largest takeaway is that need for additional staff and specifically that need for core teachers. So core class sizes, both at the K through 3 and 4 through 12 levels, we are currently 187 positions below what EBF would consider fully funded. Some additional needs. EBF really, again, is a research-based document, and it's put a lot of credence in this concept of instructional facilitators, having an instructional coach or facilitator at every building. Right now, we have some of those positions district-wide. We maybe have some employees that are doing it as part of being on a leadership team or a stipend. We work with our union, who has a mentoring program through their national organization, but we don't really have these dedicated positions in every building. And then the final takeaway I'd say is that the EBF model, again, research-based, believes highly in extended day and summer school programs, being able to offer those programs consistently and every year. Where we've offered those programs, both in the current year and the past, it's been primarily as a result of grant funding. And a lot of that grant money is now currently the ESSER grant. So we are meeting some of this goal now, but there will be that longer-term challenge to try and meet these summer school and other programming needs going forward. So with that, just to kind of confirm what our next steps would be, first getting back to our budget adoption, we will update the board as necessary. I don't anticipate significant changes, but if there is, I will come before the board with any material changes. Otherwise, I will present a tentative budget at the July 17th meeting with our legal budget hearing and adoption scheduled for the August 21st meeting. On the evidence-based funding that we just discussed, I think it does talk to the need for continued advocacy for Indian Prairie, both with our statewide legislators and within our community. We do plan on moving forward with this concept of matching our legal budget to the evidence-based funding, and so we will look to do that as we present the 23-24 budget. And then finally, we do have an item in our strategic plan. Again, we're addressing our strategic goal number 4 this evening, to provide a long-term plan to reduce class sizes for the district. So this was a good first step, kind of doing that analysis to what those evidence-based funding goals are. We will look to present that long-term plan or that long-term goal about a year from now in June of 2024. With that, I am open to any questions. I will note there are several slides which are considered to be other resources or appendixes kind of tied to here. Again, I hope I didn't get too into the weeds tonight. So if that is of interest to you, hopefully there's some additional material that's available. Both IASB does for example, have the full calculation for all 6 years available through their website. So again, it's a very data intensive, but that is a resource, as well as, again, some of the research that we mentioned throughout the presentation.
All right, thank you. Ms. Dumming?
Wasn't expecting to go first. Let's see. Slide 3. I so appreciate, Matt, you always do a wonderful job in laying everything out and really walking us through EBD. Can you just share with us that 1, 2, 3, that bullet point 4 again regarding our capital projects, and just, I really think that's something that was important for us to make sure that the community understands what's happening for us as we head towards 26.
Sure. So we, as the board knows, and as many in the community may know, we've engaged with a firm, with an architecture firm, to complete a master facility assessment of all our facilities, which hopefully is going to provide a roadmap for capital needs over the next 10 years. We are doing that because we know it's been many years since we've kept up with what the required amount of maintenance would be. We last estimated that number at about, I think, $12 to $13 million annually. And so we're trying to get a handle on what that, what those needs are, and again, put that in a long-term plan. We are fortunate to have this capital projects fund, which has accumulated some sort of one-time revenues. We made a few budgetary transfers into the fund a few years ago. We did sell some surplus land 4 or 5 years ago that went into this fund. And so we're able to fund at least the next couple years of both what we know needs to be completed today, and then what that plan's potentially going to say we need longer term. The challenge is going to come again after fiscal year 2026. What's going to be the recurring revenue source that's going to fund those needs? So we're in a good position for the next couple years to kind of start getting caught up on the work we need, but I don't think any of us believe that the amount of money in that fund is going to be sufficient to do what we really need to do as part of that plan.
So that'll be something that we'll be certainly trying to look at and determine how we move forward as we get closer. Slide 5, where we looked at our forecast and then where we currently stand. Just interestingly, can you share a little bit, because on the where we look at salaries and benefits would corresponds, and where we see that lower from what the budget had looked at. Can you share a little bit as what's happening there?
Sure. So is that the current year? Is that slide 4 potentially? Okay.
Well, I was looking at slide 5.
Okay. Yeah,
You're right. You're
Okay.
You're
And-
right.
and I
was,
can- and
yes.
I can cover it.
I was looking at the
So,
2024. Yes.
Again, talked about this a little bit at the February meeting as well, but it's been a very challenging environment for hiring and retaining staff. Our biggest challenge has been with our teaching assistant positions, where at times we've been over 100 vacancies in teaching positions. And what that creates is a need to still find a way to provide those services. And so some of what you see with that variance is that our salaries and benefits are lower because we've not filled those positions with our employees, but our purchase services are higher, meaning we've gone out to third-party staffing agencies, third-party contractual providers to provide some of those services. Ideally, we would like those services to be performed by our employees. There's a cost savings generally when it's our employees, as well as just having additional control, and we believe that's a better way to serve our students long-term. But this is really the short-term need. It is to do it through purchase services. So when we present next year's budget, we are hoping that those positions are filled, and we present that as again, kind of, we go back, if you will, to presenting that as salary and benefits. We're optimistic we won't be in the same situation, but if we were, you could see that again next year where, again, salary and benefits are maybe a little under budget, but that purchase services is above.
And then just the last comment that I had, I'm certain some of my co-board members may point to this as well, but the tier 2, I mean, just the advocacy that's so critical for us. I mean, every other tier just seems to be taken care, you know, we're suffering.
Yeah,
And-
I completely agree. I think, again, I go back to kind of this, you know, 2 or 3 sentence summary of evidence-based funding, and it says 49% of the new money will go to tier 2. And that was what was kind of presented, and I think that's what a lot of our legislators still think is happening. But the sort of caveat is that tier 1 districts are also considered tier 2 districts. So they get their pot of money, and then they also get to come to our pot of money. And, you know, I use the analogy, it's like being at Thanksgiving dinner, and, you know, maybe there's 2 or 3 tables, and you're in the last table, and, you know, you think it's finally your turn, and then you find out everyone else gets seconds before you get to have your first. And that's kind of what's happening here with the formula, in my opinion. And again, I don't think, I think there's a lot of legislators, a lot of people who follow this and who have a vested interest who don't quite understand that piece.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Karubis.
I appreciate the presentation. I really like where you've taken it. It's a very complicated subject, trying to get behind the curtain, so to speak, on this. And so trying to whittle it down to a digestible bite is hard. Slide 12. You might have mentioned this before. I don't recall, but you can also see on some of the factors where the formula might not be making the difference, but the hold harmless is making the difference. So how much of the intention with the formula of we need these cost factors funded, we are consider your local resources, and then you get from left field, there's a hold harmless because the students dropped, and it kind of blows up the formula completely. But there's advantages to having the hold harmless, and I understand it. But when a hold harmless starts trumping the cost factors, there should be some delta or consideration of that. Is the formula driving the change, or is it just the fact that we lost students? So when I look at this, I see Rockford and City of Chicago lost significant population, and they gained funding. Did they gain funding because the formula pushed more students to them, or because the hold harmless did? Don't need to comment now. It's just an observation.
Yeah, I'll just make a comment. I mean, I think, the alternative, and you see this in other states where there are boards of education that come to this time of year looking at needing to make significant cuts because their enrollment drops unexpectedly. And so I don't know what the right answer is, but that's, again, what the discussion sort of revolved around. This was a fairly controversial discussion. There was some talk, well, should the hold harmless be on a per student basis as opposed to a total number? But ultimately, you're correct that this is what the formula has. It's based on all dollars, and it is driving some significant changes.
Yeah, we were intimately involved with the hold harmless, and it benefited us, and we wanted to make sure it was in there. But how long does it last? There's a lot of different. Is it 100% hold harmless, or is it a sliding scale that goes down? There's a lot of ways to do the calculus on it. I get it. You can't. There's ups and downs in the district, and it needs to be managed. But it's an observational point to say we spent all this time looking at these 34 factors, and then 90% of the state funds are the result of the fact that we lost 1,000 students,
Same as, yeah.
you know, to overly simplify it. Is it really the formula, the evidence that's driving it, or is it this hold harmless that was tacked on for political reasons? Page 13. Could you comment briefly about kind of the fact that like the adequacy, the property taxes up and down, the new development up and down is looked at like relatively across the state? So if there's more development locally and prices are going up locally, but they're suffering in Rockford, well, the formula takes all that into account, you know, to some extent. And so it's not just what happens in our district that's important. And so there might be, you know, a potential stadium being built somewhere in the state, and that might have an impact on what we're doing here. And you might not think that it's relevant, but it impacts state funding for education because of one of the, you know, the deltas in the formula. So comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I will say of the elements of this formula, I think that local capacity target's probably the most complicated. And so, again, trying to really go through that would be a whole nother presentation, another night maybe. But you're correct. It's looking at, it's not just looking at your, for any of these elements, it's not just looking at your district's data, it's comparing that to then the other 850 districts in the state, whether that's your enrollment, your adequacy target, or in this case, your local funding capability. I think that speaks to sort of the next slide a little bit too, where or two slides on slide 15, where we've seen that surplus for tier 3 and 4 districts grow. Again, they're not receiving that new state funding, but we're saying, hey, these are districts that are so strong locally already, and because of that, they're capturing a greater percentage of local revenue than the tier 1 and tier 2 districts as well. So I think that's really part of this story too, of, again, this further divergence of the tiers does speak to that point too.
Slide 17, the fact that there's significant expenditures that are not included in the formula. And so, you know, transportation, food service, those are a huge amount of our budget. Let's not consider student size. Let's not consider, you know, it's at some point you made a formula in order to try to take in all these variables and try to have tiers and look at local resources, and then you said, you know what, for food and transportation, we're not going to do it. Yep. And so I think when we went through making the political sausage at the time, we said, well, we can't figure out all these elements. Let's keep these to the side, and we'll just try to get as much of it done as we can. And so I think now is a good time to revisit some of these and say, oh, does it still make sense? Why not? Why not run these through the formula? And when you look back at the state budget on slide 11, is it 11? Yeah. You can see that, you know, $8 billion on the bottom right runs through the formula, but there's still $2 billion that doesn't. Well, does that still make sense?
Yeah, completely agree. And you're correct. I think the point on transportation and some of those specifics is there was getting back to some of the political challenges in 2017, there was a thought that, well, we can't figure this out today, but let's put it on the to-do list. And here we are 6 years later, and it's still on the to-do list. I do think one of the things that's telling about this slide is just when you look at that growth of that other category. So the other category's gone from 260 million to 570 million. So that is saying the legislators, the Department of Education is funding things outside of the formula that presumably people think are important and need to be funded and want to be funded, but why aren't we making the effort to include that in EBF? why aren't we making the push to try and move more of those other categories or those categoricals into EBF?
And then, we're trying to move some of our budget to align with some of these cost factors, elements. But those are possible investments. The state doesn't require, as part of the funding, to say, well, you got to have this many teachers. It just says, based on the formula, we're going to pay you X amount of dollars in order to, we calculated X amount of dollars thinking you should have this many teachers, but you can do with it what you want. So it's unrestricted. Now there's certain categories that are restricted, the special education and the low income and English language learners. But I think the point being is, as if we move to a budget that is perfectly aligned with, we brought in this money, it says we should have this, we don't have this, and nobody else is doing it. It's gonna look bad on us, where we are like the beacon of light saying this is how it should be, because it should be this way. But and at least on a reporting basis, like doesn't have to be completely mandatory. But if we're the only people doing it, and there's the state's giving people all this money saying you should spend it on teachers, and they're spending it on making glossy, shiny things instead, then that's not making the whole system accountable, especially when what happens in district over here impacts our funding from the state. So no comments needed. I just went on a tirade. That's it.
I could try and fit a comment in there, just to say that that last point of one of the challenges was that reporting element. And again, that was another thing that was put on the to-do list, and here we are 6 years later without much progress. And it's, again, it's up to individual districts to make that commitment, and I'm not aware of many other districts that are doing that right now.
My last point is, some people say, well, this is evidence-based budgeting, evidence-based funding. But the evidence part stops at a certain point, and then it becomes political, and then it becomes, trading. There's no evidence that says tier 1 should be this percent and tier 2 should be this percent. At some point it was political, saying, yes, we should consider local resources, but how much should we consider them? So we should not be intimidated. We should accept evidence saying that the class size should be this and that has benefits. But then also recognize that the evidence part stops at a certain point, and then you start arguing the political. And I think you've done a great job with that, saying it's not fair, this is where the problems are, this is where the improvements can be. So let's acknowledge it right up front, that the evidence is great, but it stops at a certain point and it becomes political. That's it, thanks.
Miss Jane.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley, for your presentation. I'm finding myself learning more and more with every presentation. So pardon me if I'm asking questions that may seem repetitive. I want to echo what Member Karubas just stated about the presentation, particularly slides 13 through 15. I found that was very helpful in providing a more nuanced understanding of how all of our districts could look very different with this formula. I found that very helpful. Few things that I could use some more, just more explanation. When does the state make these calculations about our adequacy? Like, is this something they do year long, and then they determine on this date that this is what District 204 needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is going to be data that trails a year. So they're going to look at, for example, for next school year, they would look at 23 enrollment and population data. So it does trail a year, and I think again we've mentioned some of the challenges of the hold harmless, mentioned some of the challenges with migrants, and some of the movement we've seen in and out of districts increase with the state. So you are always going to be dealing with data that's a year old. But it does take enrollment data from the prior year. I think it takes it at 2 separate points to kind of average it, and again, similarly, all the data is kind of backward looking by 6 months to a year.
Okay. And we've heard a lot about our district being funded or meeting 84% adequacy. So can you explain to me again slide number 18, which shows a number of percentage of adequacy at 93%?
Sure. So the state EBF calculation, again, is all sort of conceptual numbers, if you will. It does not tie directly to our budget or our audited financial statements. So there's going to be some difference there. And then the second piece is that the state assumes 10%, you'll cover 10% of your adequacy target through other means. So for 2023, we had an 84% adequacy percentage based on the EBF. When we actually look at our actual budget, we get to 93. So that's primarily using those federal funds to cover a portion of those expenditures, using student fees, building rental revenues, interest revenue, just some of the sort of miscellaneous pieces that are kind of built to make that 10%. The real reason that's there is the federal government does not allow you to impact your state funding based on how much federal funding you have. They call that supplementation, or they want the states and the local units of government to demonstrate a maintenance of effort. So they don't want to have a situation where the federal government increases their budget and then the state says we're not going to support education. So the way that we got around this as sort of part of the EBF module was to kind of say, okay, well, there's going to be a 10% buffer that's going to be picked up with some of these other revenue sources.
And much of the federal funding, if I'm correct, that's not always guaranteed year to year, but that's based on our grant writing and our actively soliciting federal funding.
Combination. So I'd say the most significant pieces of federal grant are recurring revenues, and that's the IDEA grant, the Title I grant, and our National School Lunch Program grants. So those largest pieces are recurring, but you're right. There is a portion that is competitive grants and things that we're submitting either to the federal government or to the state that's administering a federal government. And then, again, we've talked a few other times, we have the ESSER funds, which is also completely outside of EBF. And again, in general, probably went more towards the Tier 1 districts, but what isn't included as part of the formula.
Okay. And again, I really found slide 17 to be very informative in terms of understanding what is not included. And so I know right now transportation is something being discussed heavily with in our community. Can you explain currently how our transportation is funded?
Yes, that's a good question. So transportation remains one of those 3 categorical programs that the state, I think, has about $1 billion for on the current budget. So that's a reimbursement-based grant. In order to sort of qualify for the reimbursement, you do have to follow the guidelines for the state transportation, that ISB or the Illinois Department of Transportation puts out on following the guidelines. Students are provided transportation if they live outside 1.5 miles, or if they experience significant hazards otherwise getting to school if they're less than 1.5. So we do have to sort of play by the rules, if you will, to get that money. If we deviate from that creates situations where those funds are not covered at all by state money, and we're covering that completely by local. The reimbursement percentage tends to work out to be between 40 to 50%. So we are still, even within that state funding, we're still funding a significant portion locally.
Okay, thank you. And last question, do we have any, I thought there was discussion about revisiting this formula for evidence-based funding. Any update on that?
Yeah, there
you're aware of?
there is a statewide review panel that was sort of put in as part of the legislation that in theory is kind of continuing to evaluate it and evolve and as it evolves and hope, would hopefully make recommendations for future changes. I think with COVID, that's been a big challenge in getting that really off the ground. There were some, I would say, smaller items discussed by that panel this past fall that didn't really move very far. Honestly, it would have probably been detrimental to Indian Prairie. There were some additional discussions about how to sort of target some of the higher poverty districts further in the formula. So again, probably pushing more money to tier ones. Personally, and again, to build on what Board Member Krubis said, in my belief, we've got a lot of things that every district engages in that's not in the formula. Why wouldn't we start there to try and find a way to get those into the formula before we start kind of, for lack of a better word, getting political and trying to find elements that may benefit one but not the other. So the short answer is yes, there is that committee in place, but there's not been a lot of actual legislation or movement that's been provided.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mr. Rising.
So before I ask questions, I just want to make some statements. So latest rankings of school districts across the country, our school district is ranked the 36th best school district. I went through and looked at all those school districts that rank higher than us. It's amazing how much funding those school districts have across the country, more than our district. That is primarily based on academics, so our students and our families have so much to do with that. But in order to educate our students to the best of our ability, that takes finances. From your presentation last year, you had a comparable. And you touched on this a little bit, is roughly we spend about $13,700 per student. That average that districts in Illinois are spending per student is about $16,000. So we're spending significantly less than the state average. That's not because of poor budgeting. That's because of resources that we have locally, at the state level, and at the federal level that we receive as a district. All our comparable districts, Wheaton, St. Charles, Naperville 203, Elmhurst, Geneva, Barrington, Batavia, all spend above the state average at the low end to up to $19,000 per student. And these are districts that we compete with academically. But we have significantly less resources, and you're seeing some of the things that we've had to cut back on as far as staffing, facilities, so on and so forth. If you could go to slide 3, I believe 4. So on this current slide, if I could just point you towards the surplus and deficit, we were projecting about a $7.6 million surplus, but because of the wireless and technology stuff, now we're only at about a $52,000 excess. Is that correct?
No, the budget we passed in the fall was that 52,000. We're now projecting 7.6
Okay.
million. Yeah, again, talked about it at the last presentation. The other local, which is showing a $5 million positive variance, that's really driving a lot of that increase, and that's the funds we're using to fund this wireless project.
Right.
That's really interest revenue from rising interest rates, and then replacement taxes.
Okay. Slide 6. Property tax rate. I think it's important that the community knows and understands the collective we, don't like to have high property taxes either. But I think it is important to understand that Illinois as a state ranks, in the top 5 lowest for not being able to fund education. The reason why tax rates are so high, primarily, is because the state relies on local property taxes to fund education. The fact that we have been able to lower our tax rate, I think, needs to be celebrated in the last 10 years. Now, again, a lot of that had to do with paying off some of our debt, right? But the fact that we've been able to do that with the low funding sources that we have compared to all our comparable districts is pretty significant, and I think our community should be happy of that. Yes, their property taxes may have gone up, but their portion of the school district, that tax rate has gone down. So I just wanted to point that out. If you could go to slide 9, the evidence-based funding. You really didn't touch on that this much this time, but a large part of what the evidence-based funding is based on is how much a school district can generate locally through the equalized assessed value of all the property. All our comparable districts, while they may have similar equalized assessed values, we've got 26,000 kids that we're dividing into that equalized assessed value. That's why we have less money to spend per student. Thank you for bringing up that seconds at the dinner table thing, because I think that's important to know. Yes, I have tremendous empathy for districts that do not have a lot of local revenue. But the fact that the tier 3 and tier 4s that really aren't as reliant upon state money, you know, are functioning well on their own, and tier 2s who have less local revenue are expected to act like a tier 3 and tier 4. Meanwhile, the tier 1 districts get to get firsts, and then they get to get seconds before we get ours. In addition to that, a lot of those districts qualify for, you know, poverty grants, more federal money. We talked about the ESSER funds, you know, back last year, where we only got $497 per student, and districts like CPS and Rockford got $8,000 per student, and it had no impact on their evidence-based funding. So I agree with Ms. Deming. We need to raise some of this because it's getting to be significant of what we can keep doing with the resources that we have. Is it fair to say that districts that have lower equalized assessed values have higher property tax rates? So in other words, if you are in an area that has very high property wealth, so you know, North Shore, for instance, areas that have very high property wealth, is it fair to say that they have a lower property tax rate, and areas that have lower wealth have a higher property tax rate? Is that a fair statement to make?
It's a fair statement, and I wrote it down to try and provide some data on that. So we'll investigate that. But yeah, that would be fair. Again, as you mentioned, within our 8 comparable districts, we have the lowest EAV per pupil. I believe we have the second or third highest tax rate. So within our 8 comparable groups, that holds.
Yeah.
And I do believe it holds on a statewide
And
comparison as
then
well.
the last thing, slide 13. Thanks for putting this together. I think it shows a very important thing to look at here. Rockford, clearly, they do not have an ability to go out for more local resources. I think that's why you're seeing that negative of the purple, which is local. What I found interesting here is CPS. CPS was still able to grow their local funding. Something that wasn't mentioned that is unique to CPS that no other district in the state can say is that CPS generates $1.6 billion in TIF revenue. That went up from $1.2 billion last year. that is money that should be going to CPS. Not all of it, right? But that is money that the city has. The interesting thing about that is with CPS being a tier 1, is that the mayor, whoever that is, or now currently Brandon Johnson, they can also take that $1.6 billion and give that money to CPS. So not only do they have the local funding, not only do they have the state funding, but they also have TIF money that they can use to fund their schools as well. I thought it was important to mention that, because I think in addition to all the other things that we need to educate our legislators on, that also has to be one of those things, in that TIF money.
I agree. I think, again, a topic we could have spent all night on, of how CPS is maybe a little bit different animal than the rest of the 850 districts throughout the state. So again, the TIF money is definitely part of that. We mentioned the pensions earlier, that they do manage a different pension fund than us. The other piece to talk about property taxes, they do not pay, the overwhelming majority of their debt is actually paid off with state aid. So whereas every other district relies on local funding to pay their debt service, CPS has pledged evidence-based funding money for that. So again, when you talk about being able to potentially use the funds as intended, like we talked about earlier, I think Board Member Krubis has mentioned that. With CPS, at least a portion of that evidence-based funding is going to bonded interest payments that, for every other district, will be made with local funds.
I actually lied. One more question. I just want to clarify that I'm not complaining about districts that have less local resources, you know, the Rockfords, the Waukegans, the Elgins, the CPSs. They have greater needs, so they do need to spend more per student here. Where I have a problem, and this goes back to, is kind of something Mr. Krubis alluded to, is where does the evidence stop? And that evidence-based funding, does the state ask specifically where our district is spending the additional state revenue that either tier 1 or tier 2 districts receive? Are they monitoring that we're putting those towards those 20 factors or whatever, there's 35 factors that make students perform better?
Yeah, good question. There was a requirement in the original legislation that be done. I will say at this point it's cursory. It's not a very thorough document that we provide to the state, and to my knowledge, it's not heavily relied on for any real purpose other than fulfilling their responsibility. Again, I think that ties to the fact that we still haven't aligned district budgets and district audits to evidence-based funding, so that it's hard to make that comparison at this time.
Thanks.
Ms. Jentz, I know you're new to this. But
Yes, no, I know.
If you have any
Yes.
questions.
I'm very new, as we all know, but I want to thank you first of all, because your February presentation and this one have been honestly so informative and great, and you walked me through the February one. So I just wanted to start by thanking you. Really, all my fellow board members touched on a lot of things. My only question is, and unlike Mark, I will just have one, I promise. No, but is there a threshold at all as far as tier 4 districts where they're at such a surplus that the state might look and say, instead of decreasing, like just honestly not fund really anything? Or will they just continue to fund them and let the surplus grow?
The hold harmless is got no end point. So
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
there are districts. There are districts that are pushing that 150, 175, 190% funding
Right.
when you get onto the North Shore. So, and yeah, again, they haven't changed that yet. So I'm
Okay.
not sure what.
Maybe that's something we could advocate for too, as we're advocating more for tier 2.
It's true.
Yes, yeah. So no, thank you very much though, Matt.
you.
All right, thank you for the presentation. It was interesting. There were things after listening to a lot of budget talks over the last 5 years or whatever, and I thought there was new things in here that like struck me as things I wasn't aware of. I wanted to go back to slide 11. And, you know, if you're just someone looking at this from the top, you go, oh, we went from 7.6 billion to 10.1 billion. We put a lot more money into schools in the state, and that looks conceptually very positive. And you go to the next slide and you see, oh yeah, well, some of these different districts have been helped pretty dramatically, but not us. And then if you go to the next slide, oh no, let's see, where is it? Oh, it is slide 14. So if I look at our difference in funding, and when I go back to 2017 too, so I was relating like your comments about the stability of the funding, so I appreciate that, because when we were early on the board, we didn't know if we were going to get our categorical payments. So going back to Ms. Jane's question about transportation and things, I mean, there were years when we didn't get a payment from the state, and it was millions and millions of dollars. So I appreciate that we're in a much more stable state now. So I like that aspect of it. And but I do really have a problem with the whole especially these districts that are so high. I mean, come on. But, okay. But if I look at slide 14, and I look at our cost per student, or our funding need per student, from 2017 to now, went up about $2,000 per student. If I calculate 11,854 versus 13,775, so about $2,000 more in expense, and primarily from costs of CPI increases, and also the profile of our student needs is the biggest indicators. And then if I look at slide 14, how did we get help? Do you remember that nice formula of going from 7.3 billion to 10 billion? We got $140 per student from the evidence-based funding model, which is terrible. So I'm worried. We had, ESSER, we had the same issue where all these, like Mr. Rising pointed out, I'm pointing at everybody else's comments, but they were important. So I am in favor of doing whatever we can to help push our legislators to know that this story and this formula is not working for us. And unfortunately, Tier 1 is like a small subset of the districts in the state. So it's like most of them don't care. But I agree with Ms. Deming about that. I think that we need to make our story known, and it just continues to be a great source of frustration to see this. I also am worried about Chicago lobbying to get more of that evidence-based funding model shifted back to them. So is there any more talk about them trying to get pushed down to Tier 1 so that they?
Yeah, again, I think to Board Member Jane's comment earlier, some of the small initiatives that have come out of that EBF review panel, I think, have been presented specifically with CPS in mind and trying to trigger them or move them back down to a Tier 1. So I do think that's true. I think both mayoral candidates during the recent Chicago election were very clear that, that they expect the state to give them more money, and they both sort of touted a strength of theirs would be how they were going to convince the state to give them more money. So, I think that is something we need to watch carefully. And again, if it's done through the current EBF in a way that increases funding for all districts, it could benefit us. If it's a take from one district to give to CPS, then obviously that wouldn't benefit us.
So thank you. I'm frustrated on this stuff, but keep going. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Our next presentation is from Mr. Doug Icarius and Mr. Mike Purcell regarding advanced placement, U.S. government, and biology and honors biology course updates. Oh, is it just Mr. Purcell?
Dr. Purcell will be presenting tonight
Oh,
without
doctor,
Mr.
yeah,
Icarius.
doctor, congratulations, yeah.
Oh, congrats.
Hi, good evening. Is it morning? Hold on. So I'll be significantly faster than that, I promise. Thank you for some time this evening. This is really a culmination of a lot of really hard work with some of our professionals, some of our teachers who have come together in 3 different courses that we'll talk to you about tonight. As we talked about not too long ago, we came to you with kind of our meeting the strategic plan goal for a 5-year curriculum cycle. And one of the things that I mentioned when we were up here, there was 5 or 6 of us here talking at the time, that these curriculum projects kind of come in all shapes and sizes. And tonight is a good example of that, as opposed to something that we talked about with like Spanish 1 when Tara Fowler and I came and talked to you about that. That was really a rewrite, right? Completely kind of starting over and doing those things. We wanted to come and talk to you about approving a curriculum and then talking about resource support that. These are a little different in that there's not really a rewrite. There's a little bit of cleaning up and those kinds of things. So there's not going to be an ask for approval of new curriculum because there's not new curriculum, right? There's just us kind of getting on the same page, a little bit of, like anything, if we're doing this in 3 different places, we're doing the same class, over time you start drifting away from each other a little bit. So that this wasn't that we were going to do it differently, we're just going to do it more of the same. Right, so that was really the curriculum work. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that they did just to lay the groundwork for the ask at the end, which is that we need some new resources to support this work. So all of that backstory goes into the minor course updates and potential for some new resources to support this learning. These are along board policy 640, 660, and 6210, 640 in curriculum development. 660 in curriculum content, because these are, all the classes we'll talk about tonight meet a graduation requirement for us. And board policy 6210, which are instructional materials. I want to start by thanking the teachers who worked on the biology and honors biology, representatives from each of our high schools, John Farnan, Jim Nielsen, Pam Westfall, Chris Schramm, Melissa Turner, Lisa Brahini, Adrian Toomey, and Joe Rizika, as well as the science department chairs, who have done great work in helping to guide this work, aligning the Illinois State Standards for Learning, which include the NGSS, which is the National Science Standards, which were adopted by the state, and the 3-dimensional science learning standards. Biology and honors biology, typically a grade 9 class for almost all of our students, and fulfills one of the 3 science credits required for graduation. The scope and sequence work here was minor in all areas, really just kind of more of a remodel than a kind of redo, right? So, but really looked at, the pieces that they looked at were the things that were according to the strategic plan, was about achievement, equity, and student engagement. You'll hear a little bit more about those particularly as we get into the resources to support that work. Ensuring the alignment, and that was really a lot of the biology work, is that we had just gotten out of alignment a little bit, so it was just a reminder of what the scope and sequence was and making sure that we're all on the same page. And then a need for updated resources. The last time biology and honors biology were adopted, I've been here long enough that I can say that it was before I started. That means something now, right? So it was 8 years ago actually that those were done, and really what we found is that we're coming to a point where those resources came in. These actually did have digital components to them when they came in, but they were so first generation that they're actually not usable anymore. One of the things that brought us to the table to say, do we need to do something, is that the vendors actually sunsetted the digital because they just can't patch it up anymore. It's so old in the digital world. So that brought us to coming together. So those folks have been working since last summer to really kind of make sure that those scope and sequences are tight, and then have had some time to come and review resources to support that work. Upon approval, if that happens in the next board meeting, we'll bring those vendors in to do some professional learning, and also have the curriculum team, the folks that I was talking about earlier, share the scope and sequence work to make sure that all of our teachers are on the same page, kind of moving forward, and all the resources that they've sort of curated, and good instructional tactics and all of those things along the way as well. So to the kind of the ask part of the presentation here, our biology team is recommending the very unoriginal title of Biology by National Geographic. As we've talked about, and you'll hear this from me 3 times tonight, that we evaluate all of our resources in 3 areas. One is the instructional benefits, and that aligns strictly to the strategic plan. The instructional benefits are looked at under achievement and equity and engagement. The second part, we talk about digital integration. Not only how does that work from the student end, but also how does it work on the back end? Is it easy for us to service getting those things rostered up? We don't want our teachers having to do digital maintenance, right? This all needs to happen through our technology staff. So we have our technology folks vet these products in order to do that. And the third is fiscal responsibility, that we look at these and compare all 3 of those legs in the stool, and really rely on our teachers to look at instructional benefits under number 1. One of the things that we loved about this title was not only was it more accessible to our students and more engaging, we felt like we were more engaging in terms of the visuals and the language, that they used. But one of the other piece that the team brought to me that they were really excited about was that the National Geographic, obviously a huge name in science, right? They have a lot of scientists sort of under their umbrella, and they really highlight scientists both on the digital and the physical platform to really introduce topics and to reinforce them. And what they loved, and they brought to me, and they have said a dozen times, if they've said it once, is that they love that the scientists that are highlighted look like our kids. And the diversity of the scientists that are highlighted in the National Geographic book represent the diversity of scientists that are out there and look like the kids that are taking these classes. And they were really, really excited about that as part of what they really saw in this being a great benefit to us. So the physical and digital resources definitely are supportive of the student, that they like that these really tied to the outcomes. And that last piece of these real-life scientists, National Geographic is also, we're looking forward to partnering with them and maybe even bringing those scientists in on a Skype call or a kind of a mini field trip or those kinds of things, even inside the school to kind of bring that kind of biology more to life, right? So that is something that they are super excited about with that title, and really excited for me to bring that to you this evening. The honors biology, we had definitely looking for a more sciencey book, right, to get at a kid who kind of reads at a different academic level typically, right, and has probably a more tuned into kind of a science or lifestyle, right? So we found a book that we are excited about as well. Savas, for those of you guys who have been doing this for a while, is it was spun off by the Pearson Corporation, right? So that's a name that you'll hear a little more often. And Savas is the K-12 version of that. Miller Levine are 2 really well-known and renowned authors in this space, and they've written this book. And again, we evaluated in these same 3 areas and feel really confident that this is going to really meet the needs of our honors biology book in a way that the current title just isn't doing. That they really liked that was tied to the course outcomes and really gave an opportunity to do a deeper dive into those areas. One of the things that we take a lot of pride, there's not a lot of additional topics in our honors biology class. What we really do is to go deeper, right, into the topics that we're learning, and that's really the difference between those 2 classes. And this resource will help us, help our teachers to help our kids to do that, and we're very excited about that. They like the reading supports in there, and the digital aspects of this title were really, really outstanding. So those 2 different titles for different classes we're really very excited about. A lot of the same people doing this work, and really we're able to wear a couple different hats to differentiate between the 2. As with all resource proposals, the purpose of tonight is to bring these things to light and to ask for any questions here in a moment. These resources will be on display in the district office, in my office if you want to come see them. And then I'll be back in a couple weeks and asking for approval for both of these at that time. Before we kind of switch over to the next kind of presentation, which is the government one, maybe it's just to isolate these if there's questions about biology specifically. Wanted to ask if there's any questions from the board about the work or the resources.
So I'll just open it up. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. April 4th, 2016, we updated the middle school science curriculum. I believe it was to iQuest. You can go back and look. When they were evaluating this biology curriculum, and I know it's all tied to the NGSS science standards, right? Did they make sure that there was a good transition from middle school to the high school, that followed kind of some of the iQuest inquiry-based curriculum that they had and adopted at the middle school? And 2016, are we gonna have to start looking at that curriculum again?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mr. Rising. A little bit of yes and a little bit of no. So we didn't want to get too tied to iQuest because, as you're saying, we're not going to have that forever, right? So we didn't want to be in the iQuesting business, right? But we wanted to make sure that we are taking the things that we value in terms of our middle school science education, which is really to think scientifically, right? And to build our capacity to both kind of get in and understand things, both in the making sense of science and to do the problem solving. And one of the things that our middle school science team does really, they're outstanding at is having kids both do that and get hands-on, and also develop a line of reasoning. They use the claim evidence reasoning model to do that, and we're able to leverage that not just in science but also in other content areas. So we absolutely do pick up some of the really core values of that without being tied to what vendor provides that with us.
Good.
Anything else?
I didn't have a question. I just had a couple of quick comments. Dr. Purcell, the slide 5, I just truly appreciate the alignment between our schools. Sometimes students may feel that they are getting something different. Critical for our schools to make sure that they're all receiving the same thing. We have excellent teachers. Sometimes students may feel that like I said, that they're just different things that they're walking away with from our classes. So thank you for that alignment concern and ensuring that teachers from each of our schools is working on that curriculum to make sure that they're sharing the same things. And I tell you, I just was so smiling when you talked about the opportunities for engagement. I mean, it's no secret that you'll hear me and our board members will hear me just talk about making sure that that we're providing the same things, but that access for our students to see people that are diverse and that look like them. If you see it, you can be it. Was totally smiling. So I love that creativity, the potential for engagement to bring scientists that are doing the work for our students to be able to potentially have a chance digitally to speak. Great job. I really love that.
Thank you. The team really did a wonderful job, and that was something that jumped off the page to them, and you kind of go in, you're never quite sure what you're going to find when you start doing these resource evaluations. But that really struck with them, and their excitement matched yours. So we're really lucky to work with some great professionals.
Thank you, Dr. Purcell, for your presentation. A quick question about the process when assessing resources. Were students involved in assessing student experience, both physical and digital?
So the answer is going to be different for this presentation than it is for the next one. So for our AP government, that question is going to be yes, because those are mostly seniors. For our freshman biology book, we did not do that. We get good feedback from them. Typically, it's a little bit about like how heavy is the book and how big is the font and some of those kinds of things. And that's all good and it's important, and we should, we didn't do that in this process. There were kind of enough. In this one in particular, there were so many different options because this is a book that everybody does everywhere, right? It became hard, kind of a little untenable. And our ninth grade students are super savvy and give us some really good feedback, but that was not part of the biology. We were really trying to make sure that we got all of our schools on the same page, because it's obviously a bigger team. We got a lot of adults at stake too.
Okay,
So we spent more time kind of getting their feedback.
okay, thank you.
All right, I think we can move on. Thank you very much for that.
Perfect. Second presentation is about our Advanced Placement United States Government and Politics course. I'd come to you a couple months ago to talk about actually in the fall, to talk about this class being offered as a one-semester class in addition to the full semester companion class that we have with the comparative government, AP comparative government. So this is really kind of taking the College Board, curriculum and adapting that into the one-semester class. Again, this meets those 3 board policies that I enumerated in the previous presentation. The AP U.S. government class meets our graduation requirement for government and for the state requirement for civics. So that policy 660. So we wanted to align to a couple different things that we needed to kind of stack this class into. One is the Illinois State Standards for Learning and Social Studies, particularly those around government and politics, obviously. The civic standards that are graduation requirement, and also the College Board scope and sequence, and the team has done a nice job of meeting all of those, including you were looking at the inquiry standards, which are such a part of the social studies standards, which are fairly newly revised. We had draft versions of that for a long time, but the formal adoption of that was not very long ago. So as I said, this does meet our graduation requirement for both for government and for civics. The College Board is continually updating their scope and sequence, and what has happened since the last time this class has had gotten a new resource, so that was definitely part of the need for that. And obviously, if you're talking about government and politics, you can't go too long between adoptions because there's a whole lot more government and politics that happen in the interim, right? So this again meets strategic plan priority 1, and we looked at both the curriculum and the resources through the 3 lenses enumerated here: the student achievement, equity, and student engagement. The team's done a really nice job of really keeping all of those at the fore. Really looking at how do we engage students. We do see this class, this one semester AP US Government and Politics class, as a potential entry point for some kids who maybe as well. And that was something that I highlighted for you in the fall. One of the things that I was super excited about as we brought this as a new offering. And that has shown to be the case. So as we've seen some enrollments, and we think it'll continue to become more of that case. So we're engaging a different student, all right, who's fully able. And one of the parts that we love about this is it's also a college graduation requirement. So if a kid can take this with us and they can check that off their box while they're still with us, and something that they can take with them on their journey. And certainly that it does meet an equity piece as well. There was a definite need for updated resources. The physical book that we have is woefully outdated, and there is actually not even a digital component to it. So certainly something that was needed. And just for we had talked about this back in the fall. This course has 4 units. These here: Foundations of American Democracy, Political Socialization and Political Participation, the interactions between the executive and the legislator, and then Judiciary, Civil Liberties, and Civil Rights. Obviously 4 very rich units of study that they work on. This team has been working since the fall, has representatives from all of our high schools. Just to take a minute late in the evening here to highlight those, because they've done really great work. Kelly Tufo and Joe Brennan, Chris Wolak, Sydney Newkirk, Annie Ziers, and our Social Studies Department chairs have done a great job of getting this class together and bringing this proposal to you, which is the resource to support that work is a book called Stories of a Nation by BFW Publishing. Really, the piece that the teachers really loved about this was the language that the author used was very student-friendly, right? That it was both academic, kind of rode the line between being academic and being accessible in the best way, the readability of that and the engagement. They also, the vendor does a really nice job of highlighting the cases and giving students both physical and digital access to those court cases that they can, that we can create some targeted copies of in order for them to do some highlighting and really kind of doing some note taking on those. Give some good samples of those and the questioning styles that the AP class requires. This title is brought, and we really think it's going to meet the needs of these kids in the ways that we talked about before. I skipped past this a little bit just to reiterate. We did look at through these three pieces again: the instructional benefits, the digital integration. This is a vendor that we use for other titles, so we are really confident in the platform and the fiscal responsibility of this proposal. Our next steps is to have this book available on display here in the district office, and then to come back to you in 2 weeks for your approval of by BFW at the May 15th Board of Education meeting. If there are questions about that, now would be the time.
All right, I'm just going to ask again if anyone has any questions or comments. No, thank you. I know these are a lot of work to go through and analyze and recommend new sources for our classes, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. We have legislative topics, but I think
No, we
we're
don't.
done. Yeah. Okay.
Motion
I need
to
a
adjourn.
motion to adjourn. Okay, all in favor?